Talk of civil war used to be the stuff of history class or maybe speculative fiction, but today, scholars of history and political science now openly discuss the possibility of a new American civil war. My next guest, Professor Barbara F. Walter, is an expert on civil wars around the world. She has spent years advising the CIA on the subject. In her work examining the seeds of civil war in distant lands, she started noticing some of those warning signs close to home right here in America, long before most others did. She's been sounding the alarm about the threat since at least 2008, and her message today is that we should not ignore those warning signs, but also that we can take steps to lessen the threat. Now, before she joins us, let's take a minute to dig into her findings. Walter's research looked at which countries were most likely to experience political instability and political violence in the coming years. Her work identified two key factors as highly predictive, and America checks both boxes. The first is anocracy, a term for a weakened democracy that contains elements of autocracy. The second is whether citizens have organized politically around identity as opposed to ideology. That means they make political choices based on factors like race, ethnicity, or religion. Walter's research found that both of these predictive indicators have been rapidly emerging in the United States in recent years. She writes that Donald Trump embraced identity politics explicitly and with gusto. To quote her, she says, "No Republican president in the past 50 years has ever pursued such an openly racist platform or championed white evangelical Americans at the expense of everyone else." That's a quote from Barbara Walter. For a long time, Walter found it difficult to get people to take her warning seriously until January 6, 2021. That is when Americans started paying closer attention. On that day, Trump told his supporters to fight like hell, and they would follow through with armed, sharpened flagpoles and stun guns. Most were white, most were men, Walters writes. January 6th was the grim outcome of one of the most divisive elections in U.S. history, and yet somehow it feels as though an even bigger powder keg has been building ever since. Crucially, Walter urges us to rethink our assumptions about civil war, not just its possibility, but also what such a war might look like. This is disturbing stuff. She warns us that civil wars are not typically started by the groups most people expect, the poorest or the most marginalized. Instead, they are often ignited by groups that were once politically dominant but are now in decline. Today, the U.S. is undergoing major demographic shifts, transitioning from a majority white Christian nation to a majority non-white population that's expected to happen by 2045. This shift means that those who no longer hold a majority of the vote could lose political power. According to Walter, a new American civil war would likely be a war of insurgency fought by militias using guerrilla tactics, including terrorism. Those groups would avoid engaging directly with the military, instead targeting civilians, black churches, synagogues, federal judges they deem hostile. America, she warns, cannot afford to keep putting off this possibility. A subset of the country's population has long enjoyed privileges and power, and they're not going to let go without a fight. Some of them are not going to let go without a fight, she says. In her book, How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, Walter writes, quote, "No one wants to believe that their beloved democracy is in decline or headed toward war. The decay is often so incremental that people often fail to notice or understand it, even as they are experiencing it. If you were an analyst in a foreign country looking at events in America the same way you'd look at events in Ukraine or the Ivory Coast or Venezuela, you would go down a checklist assessing each of the conditions that make civil war likely. And what you would find is that the United States, a democracy founded more than 2 centuries ago, has entered very dangerous territory. The United States is an anocracy for the first time in more than 200 years. Let that sink in. We are no longer the world's oldest continuous democracy. The question for America moving forward is whether voters can be persuaded that their democracy works and is critical to their safety, and whether leaders will choose to reinstate its guardrails." That is a quote from Barbara Walter, who joins me now. Barbara F. Walter is a professor of international affairs at the University of California, San Diego. She's the author of the book, How Civil Wars Start and how to stop them. I want to talk to you about both those things, how they start, but really specifically how to stop them, because we don't want to see this happen in this country. Your book was published in 2022. How have you observed how things have changed in America since then? Are you still as worried as you were when you wrote those words that we quoted?
I'm still as worried, but for slightly different reasons. It's been a really interesting path since 2022, or actually 2020. When I wrote that quote about America no longer being the longest continuous democracy, when we entered the anocracy zone, that was after Trump's first term. That was at the end. It was right after the 2020 election, when for the first time in American history, a sitting president refused to accept the results of an election and was actively trying to overturn them. That put America in the anocracy zone. Then we had January 6th, and everybody was wondering, okay, what's going to happen? And to my great happiness, Trump did leave office. We had a relatively peaceful transition, and we had a new administration in the White House that actually believed in the rule of law, believed in democracy, and America's democracy score rose. So we got out of this anocracy zone. Today, we're back in it. So, and we're back in it, and we're likely to drop further than we were at the end of 2020. And that's because the second Trump administration is now actively going after many of the pillars of democracy. It's not respecting the rule of law in many cases, especially in terms of due process. These students who've been taken off of the streets and who've been detained and who have been sent to detention camps, they have all the legal rights of Americans, and yet the Trump administration is not honoring that. So there's a whole series of things that this administration is doing that is weakening America's democracy further, and we are declining. We are back in this anocracy zone.
You talk about the anocracy zone and the democracy score rising or falling. Could you just explain where that comes from? That this is just not your opinion, that there are a group of analysts, national security analysts here and elsewhere, that actually look at democracies and they rate them?
Yeah, so I wrote this book because I'd served for 5 years on a task force run by the U.S. government. It's called the Political Instability Task Force, and it's been around since 1994. The goal of the task force was to help our government, the U.S. government, predict what countries around the world were likely to experience political instability and violence within the next 2 years. So the task force was comprised of two types of people. Half of them were experts on conflict and violence, like myself. We were scholars and academics, and half were data analysts. And when the data analysts put together their predictive model, they asked the experts to give them every possible factor, every hunch we might have about factors that might lead a country on the path to civil war. And we gave them things like whether a country was poor, whether it had lots of immigrants, whether it was ethnically and religiously mixed, everything that we possibly thought could matter. And there were 38 factors. And as you mentioned earlier, when the analysts came back with their model, they said only 2 were highly predictive. And we, the experts, were very surprised. They were not the 2 factors we thought would be important. We thought it would be important if you had a population that was really angry at the government because it was really poor, or if you had groups that were heavily discriminated against. Those would be the people who would organize and rebel. And it turns out they're not. They're not. It turns out, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it turns out that America was, to your surprise, had these predictive indicators. And people listening to this might be thinking, this can't possibly happen here. But one of the things that you've seen in your studies time after time, when it does happen in other countries, that people weren't expecting it. So yes, God forbid that something like this ever happens here. So what can we do to prevent something like this from happening? And you've noted that social media has accelerated the conditions in the United States. So what role does social media play, and what can be done to bring this sort of predictive possibility to tamp that down? Yeah. So we'll be looking at a brighter future.
Michelle, I used to think and this is still true, the simplest and easy way to tamp this down, to reduce the risk of political violence here in this country, would be to regulate social media. It's such an accelerant in terms of accelerating Americans' distrust of democracy, therefore leading to the demise of democracy. It sows division within our country. It promotes sort of hate and anger. It gets people feeling as if they're threatened all the time, which makes them distrustful of each other. I no longer think that's the path forward. And that's because the 5 biggest tech companies in the world, all of which are in the United States, have resisted any sort of regulation in any way. They're not even willing to enforce their own content rules. So we're not going to get reform on social media anytime soon. I increasingly believe that the way forward has to come from the bottom up, that American citizens have to want and love and defend their democracy on their own. One of the things we also know from decades of really great scholarship is that protest and peaceful resistance works. Think about the civil rights movement. I mean, I think if you'd asked anybody, would African Americans, especially in the South, will they ever get full and equal rights of American citizens? Most people would have said no. But through patience and peaceful resistance and just pushing forward, they made enormous gains. And white Americans are going to have to do that today in order to save their democracy. So I think it has to be peaceful protests. And then the second thing, and we're seeing this now in real time, don't voluntarily comply with orders that are illegal. Don't help Donald Trump implement his agenda. Allow the rule of law to allow the process to work. Don't preemptively comply.
Professor Barbara F. Walter, thank you so much. Good to talk to you. Please come back again.